he commanded respect because he was older. He was 40 at the time and physically large in stature. He was 6'4" and 275 pounds. He had a very big presence, as you'll see in picture. I'm going to hopefully insert a picture somewhere around here. He found a keen audience in teenagers and young adults who had had difficult family lives and who found the 60s to be a really tumultuous and traumatizing time. He often told the story of a 30-foot fall that he called a near-death experience. So maybe with the sleeping pills he was trying to recreate that near-death experience that he had had when he fell. I am going to read what that experience was like in his own words. He wrote a book called Christ Consciousness, and this is what he wrote. Once on a time, Norman was working as a lineman for the telephone company along the coastline of Santa Barbara, but he failed to check that his safety strap was secured. So at one time, Norman fell backwards and thought, "Oh God, this is it," about 30 feet above the ground. But cats, grown-ups, and even babies have survived even higher falls. Newspaper tells from time to time. Norman survived it too. On the way down, he tried to prepare himself for meeting the ground. But all in all, he was pulled away from his body. He heard hum and He stretched his arms forward and flew higher and higher. Below him was the coastline of California. A thought occurred to him. To leave the earth, I must exit through the polar vortex. The North Polar Vortex. Moving northward, he realized that he had not said goodbye to his dad. And then the northern hemisphere was spread out beneath him. He saw a forest descend through the Earth's core at the North Pole. You get the gist, you get the point. He had this vision. He had something like Chad Daybell's vision of life beyond the veil, beyond the living. So he also wrote the introduction for the Sunburst website, which is still up. I'll link it below if you're interested in checking it out. From my earliest childhood, I still retain memories of the divine presence within me and hovering around me. As an infant, I knew that God was indeed alive. I had not lost contact with that infinite being upon entering this life. As I grew up to the ways of the world, I began to pick up the threads of my earliest memories. I realized how trapped I had become in the outer activities of growing up. With this reflection, I sought to follow my greatest childhood desire to meet God face to face in this lifetime. I examined the truths set forth by the founders of our world religions and other enlightened beings and discovered the underlying presence of God existing there. I found that those men and women who had seen God described in ineffable, loving light. They were engulfed in the brilliance of the inner cosmic sun, the light and energy of Christ. In a matter of seconds, they knew more than they had gathered all the years of their lives. In that brilliance, that presence, they experienced a taste of immortality. So, as you can see, he believes that he has a special communication with God, which is something that we've seen with many cult and alternate religious leaders. So the group so crazy. I'm gonna put some pictures of that here, but he looks very, I don't know, like he's on the top of the world when he's in these boats, when he's like the captain of these boats, like a child living out his dreams, you know. They ended up building a school. They had a blacksmith and adobe huts or teepees for their members. And their members were also very hardworking farmers who worked, but many of them worked 12-plus-hour days. And many of them were not compensated hourly for their work, which is common of many communes that we've talked about. It's kind of like free labor. And a lot of these groups have issues with child labor as well. So the members of the group were not allowed to have sex before marriage. They weren't allowed to have any drugs or alcohol or outside possessions. Norman eventually convinced his members that he should not be doing any manual labor. So part of their wages ended up going to him so he could survive or sustain himself. And as you might guess, this ended up becoming a problem. The gap between the hardworking farmers who worked all day and the upper levels of the organization, the gap was very large. So it bred contempt. They eventually expanded and started to sell products all over the country. At their prime, they were a multi-million-dollar business, and in 1975, they were the largest organic farm in the United States. Shortly after, they purchased a 3,000-acre farm. The commune eventually owned 4 markets in the Santa Barbara area, 2 restaurants, a bakery, and had more than 300 members. He eventually expanded to Utah, Arizona, and Nevada. But at this point, the wage gap between the workers and the higher-ups was starting to really make people mad. Not only that, but some dark sides of the organization were coming to light. Not only was it found that Paulson was stockpiling automatic weapons, but he also had a serious drug and alcohol problem. While he was preaching to the group not to use drugs or alcohol, he was indulging, more than indulging, he was an addict. So the following is from the LA Times article from 1989, which I'll link below. Paulson's addiction was cited numerous times in a lawsuit filed in 1981 by about 100 former members who sought a portion of the commune's assets. They eventually dropped this suit. According to the lawsuit, Paulson was the subject of a DEA investigation in 1982 and acknowledged to the DEA that he had spent $60,000 on narcotics. But former members who were involved in handling the group's finances say that Paulson spent more like $200,000 of the community funds during the late 70s and early 80s. They say he injected Demerol, dilaudid, cocaine, and other drugs obtained fraudulently from doctors or purchased on the street. Paulson chalked down his drug use to his years of absorbing everyone else's energy. He said, "You can't sit down and talk to someone without exchanging energy with them. If that person has negative thoughts, that leaves a residue of negative members had been purged from the ranks and others left in anger. Abelman recalls the day he was exiled. Norm was sitting in his house. Norm was the leader of the cult, or the Commune. Norm was sitting in his house in a very dark room with his shirt off, and he was quite drunk, Abelman said. He said to me, "I am the man they call Jesus of Nazareth. If you believe me, you can stay. If not, get out." I was told to be out of there by the next day. For many, their departure was dramatic. Some had lived in the Commune for almost a decade, had worked 12-hour days building the business, and had given up everything that they owned to the group. It was worse than a divorce, said Abelman, who was 34, who now manages an organic farm in Goleta. But if you leave a marriage, you still have friends, neighbors, and community. But when we were forced out, we had to leave our entire world behind. After the first wave of defections, many of the Commune's businesses, which had benefited from an abundance of free labor, could not survive, said Donna Belton, a former head bookkeeper for the Brotherhood. By 1980, the Commune was unable to make payments on the ranch and had to sell it. Paulson eventually discovered a 500,000-acre cattle ranch in eastern Nevada that he was able to purchase with a small down payment. Those who stayed with the community and made the move to Nevada were faced with great hardship, Belton said. The winters were brutal. The cattle they had purchased were sick, and the growing season was so short that they could not raise enough crops to sustain themselves. Many returned to California. The remaining members struggled to keep the ranch, but eventually lost most of the property. On the remaining acres, they created a roadside gas station, a mini market, and a coffee shop. But these small businesses could support only a handful of members, so the others moved to the Salt Lake City area and opened 2 health food markets and later a demolition business. Paulson's drug use worsened during this period, and the group paid for his stay at treatment programs in Salt Lake City and Las Vegas, Belton said. Paulson ended up staying in Las Vegas for several years until he moved back to California 8 months ago. So, it had a downfall like many of the cults and communes that we see, where there's a big wave of defectors and then a small group end up staying. The 1990s saw Sunburst return to California, and about a dozen miles southeast of Lompoc at, I'm going to say this wrong, Najoqui Farms, there is their community camped out in kind of like a paradise sanctuary area. There are about, well, in the 90s, there were about 30 old-timers there. They said that they are still farming, but it is only for themselves. They no longer sell nationwide, and they're no longer trying to be like a big business. So I can't remember who recommended this, to look into this cult, commune, alt-religious group. But whoever it was, thank you very much. I'm sorry I forgot to look it up before I started the video. But it's very interesting, and I believe that some people are still practicing, but in a different way. I think they've defected from Norman and his teachings, knowing that he was a